A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again. For this instance, after a little finish-upper that I did with a film known as Absolution, maybe for the rest of this week, I could probably do some more things relative to, let's say, a duology, in which that there are two films in a certain franchise, a certain name coming from a certain company. Some people have been wanting me to talk a bit more about Aardman. Yep, a famous English claymation film series that has been going on for a pretty long time. One of these films in particular that had come from this particular company, that had come from this particular country, is known as Chicken Run. The unique story of a group of chickens coming from a certain farm that want to be set free from slavery. They were egg layers, egg hatchers, but for the most part, they were the egg layer variety, set upon to create a so-called egg farm that unfortunately doesn't go so well. It eventually boils down to the point of which that either they make their escape or they get plucked, stuffed, and roasted. Yeah, it's gonna be a bit dark. So, let's just get started here. This film in particular had come out in the year 2000. By this point, there were many other films that had come around that same year. You had Scary Movie, Thomas and the Magic Railroad, and then of course there were some sequels and some other films. Emperor's New Groove, Castaway. I mean, it was such a big year for movies. Being that it was the start of a new millennium, of course things were going to be incredible, by all means. Not as incredible as what we got today, though. In any case, though, with the case of Chicken Run, it is a bit of a different story. Not just for the fact that it was an Aardman piece, nor did it star the likes of such actors like Julie Swalha and Mel Gibson, but it also gave us the idea that it's similar to the many historical stories that we've been taught over the years about long-term slavery and the need to fight for one's freedom. And this film was certainly a big extension of such history that had unfolded over the past few centuries, especially calling back to the days when African Americans had often been enslaved. In fact, there were probably bigger examples of African American slavery turned into stories of newfound freedom and independence, like 13 Years a Slave, for instance, starring Chiwetel Ejiofor. But such films like those are things for another time. In any case, though, with Chicken Run, it's a different thing going on. The movie itself starts off one particular night with one chicken guiding a pair of other chickens to the fence of their coop. Their coop in particular is surrounded by a large fence, in which that it becomes tough for them to climb, nor is it not very easy for them to dig under. Unless, of course, they happen to get a hold of a spoon, which they manage to do so. The main idea, of course, is to have a large tunnel, so that way the chickens can crawl from underneath the fence and come out the other side free. It unfortunately doesn't quite work out too well, because on top of the fence being pretty big, there was also guard dogs, and of course, the husband of the owner of Tweedy Farm. And well, this guy, Mr. Tweedy, who was in fact played by Tony, yeah, he's much more malevolent than you might imagine. Bent on ensuring that the chickens don't escape. Because when they do, you know what's going to happen? His wife's going to come out pretty irritated. Because whatever happens, happens. In any case, though, the chicken whom is considered the lead in the bunch, with the green hat known by the name of Ginger, played by Julie Swalha, does in fact manage to escape, but unfortunately is caught by the dogs. She manages to make her way up to the porch, trying to arm herself with a nearby gnome, but the dogs just chew through it like it's nothing. However, it only gets worse. Mrs. Tweedy, the owner of Tweedy's farm, comes out looking like she had gotten out of bed and had a bit of a spa day, but now gone disturbed. Obviously, her husband is the type to suffer at her mercy. And what he does in response is simply place Ginger in a state of solitary confinement, by which case it is simply put a coal bin that sits near the house. So she basically remains in there until eventually she's let out by Mr. Tweedy and then brought back into the coop through the gate. And wouldn't you know that there is a montage that goes on? It tells us everything we need to know about the chickens, their repeated failed attempts at escaping the coop, and the many times Mr. Tweedy had gotten a hold of Ginger and placed her back in solitary confinement within that same coal bin over and over again. Till eventually, Ginger needs to work out something different. She needs to come up with a plan that is going to overshadow the likes of everything else. Because not only had she tried to dig from underneath the fence, but there was also the case in which that they used a pot to hold the gate open and allow everybody to come out from there. There was also the point where the chickens used one of their own feeding troughs as a disguise, overturning it and basically letting it pretend that it is some sort of disguise. Yeah. It's basically some sort of effort to try and get the gate open again. And then there was even a point where the dogs were fooled by the chickens because they made themselves look like Mrs. Tweedy. And while some of these plans might have seemed short-founded or not so great, they happened to be effective, but only for a short while. Because Mr. Tweedy would eventually catch on to this. The chickens will be found and all put back where they belong. Meanwhile, the whole point of the chickens being in that coop in the first place was to lay eggs. So that way, the eggs could generate sales for the farm and for the Tweedies themselves. However, sales basically lack severely. The yield grows even shorter from each passing month, and it eventually boils down to, what are they going to do next? And well, there happens to be a point where a roll call is made, not only by one of the leaders of the pack, known by the name of Fowler, whom himself was a part of the old English Ramstein Air Force. But there also was a point, believe it or not, in which that in this particular roll call, the Tweedies themselves happened to be counting the chickens and all the eggs they laid. One particular case, however, had no eggs laid in the whole week. 5 days straight, no eggs. And you know what they do with them? The chicken in particular that was called out and brought up got brought into a nearby room, a hatchet is raised, and straight up decapitation. It's audibly and visibly shown in a pretty dark manner. And the thing is that the soundtrack makes it even more horrifying to watch. And fun fact, did you know that the soundtrack for Chicken Run, as well as the sequel, was made possible by John Powell? Yep, the same guy who would eventually come around for the How to Train Your Dragon series. And there was also Harry Gregson Williams. So of course, one could argue that things could have been even more worse from here on out, in which it does almost seem that way. While Ginger basically looks up at the sky, wondering how did the other birds make it out alive, another meeting is called up. Hut 17 and Mr. Tweedy can be seen from the house looking out the window towards the coop, thinking that the chickens are in fact organized and hoping to escape. And so, obviously Mrs. Tweedy is really mad about it and orders him to stop it, claiming that it's all in his head, but he basically knows the truth about it. A lot of us do know the truth. The chickens are not only organized, plotting and scheming, unlike what Mrs. Tweedy is claiming, but the thing is, they have escape plans of all sorts gathered up. And well, even when they do manage to come up with another certain process that could actually work, as they did try to go underneath the fence, but now they were going to try and go over the fence, thanks to a certain catapult, which was made by the brains of the group. And this brains in particular hails from Scotland, known as Mac. But of course, we do have to understand the fact that not only are they difficult in understanding how the process works, but the thing is, the catapult could have actually proven to be helpful in that particular instance, even if it didn't seem that way. However, Mr. Tweety comes out again, this time sure that maybe the chickens could actually be seen as organized, as there was a certain hut meeting taking place, only to realize that the chickens were actually asleep, or at least they made it out to be that way. And thankfully Mrs. Tweety calls them back in, allowing for the chickens to recuperate. Well, despite these many efforts that take place, we do eventually get a part where Ginger happens to see somebody from above. A certain bird is up in the air, flying. She basically gets the idea that perhaps they could fly out of the coop and into freedom. A supposed promised land would await them, with fresh green grass, lots of cool water, and nice bright sunshine, far away from the likes of this farm. However, while the idea is unique, ambitious, and could actually be of a lot of help for the others, they're all in pretty big doubt about whether her plans would work or not. Considering how many times they failed, it's not very surprising. But much to Ginger's dismay, this bird that's flying eventually bumps into something and ends up injuring himself as he lands right in the coop. So, this newcomer, whom is apparently from the United States, known as Rocky the Rhode Island Red, or by Rocky Road for short, or the Lone Free Ranger, played by Mel Gibson, basically comes into the coop with some unique style and a lot of clever intuition. I mean, his words alone might as well just be some of the greatest pickup lines one would ever have on a nice big date. No matter what it is, though, it's apparently up to Rocky to find out how to unlock the power of flight for the chickens. Being that he's a rooster, it doesn't seem so surprising that the chickens might be lacking and falling behind on these things. But with all the progress that they managed to do, lots of training, lots of foolery to ensure that the Tweeties don't become suspicious, and of course the eventual plan that's settled into motion, as that same night that Mr. Tweety went out to check on the chickens, there was Mrs. Tweety's generalized idea of ditching the eggs in favor of a new technique to make profits for their farm. She gets a hold of a nearby magazine and basically sees an ad for a so-called pie machine. Yeah, she's essentially one of those kind of folk who are sick and tired of making minuscule profits. So she basically orders a giant pie machine to make up for it. Meanwhile, Rocky is still up to the many challenges that go up for the chickens in that particular coop. And while Ginger and him do seem to have some disagreements, they eventually do get along to a certain way where they can work together and hope to escape from there on out. Eventually there comes the infamous day. A truck comes in. Rocky believes that it's his own circus, as that's apparently where he was originally from. He didn't just come flying into the coop like one would expect. No. He was a different kind of person altogether. He is described as the Lone Free Ranger. However, that circus truck says otherwise. But a different truck would come in, and it was actually the one that would ship out the pie machine. And once it delivers it into the nearby barn, where Mr. Tweety would assemble the machine, the chickens would basically attempt to get back to their own work. And after some time passes, we're eventually shown what the machine can do. The Tweeties do eventually get along with the idea that maybe pie machines and a woman's touch, quote unquote, could actually help save their farm from bankruptcy. Well, whether it works or not, all they had to do was to test it out. And no better way to do it than to get an actual chicken and create a nice big pot pie from there. Mr. Tweety knows just the one, and it happens to be Ginger, whom gets brought inside with no questions asked. Rocky eventually devises of a plan to help get her out of there, in which, when he does, he manages to get inside the barn, look out from above, and see that this machine is in fact going to turn Ginger into a helpless husk, with no more than all the meat stripped off of her bones, and just, yeah, it's as gruesome as it seems. But of course, Rocky does go in after her, despite the risks, and basically speaking, he does get into some twists and turns, and a few different knots he has to untie, and all the necessary similes, metaphors, and whatnot. But there eventually comes the epic climax. This particular scene does end, thankfully, on a high note. They both make it out alive and in one piece, while the machine breaks down and is badly damaged. So, all the dismemberments and all the disengaging leads to some ruined pies, while we get to see Mr. Tweety get pied in the face by his own wife. So, we do get a sticker that does at least confirm to the rest that the machine is in fact made for mincing the chickens and turning them into pies. So of course, what do we have to do? We have to cut to a certain point where, while Mr. Tweety gets back to work on fixing the machine, they still try to devise a way to get out of there, since they obviously will have enough time to make it out before the machine is fixed. Now of course, when Rocky does try to settle things out, some arguing goes on and some bad stuff just goes on, you know. Ginger obviously is the one that doesn't want to hold back anything and just lets loose on everybody the truth that they're being given more chicken feed than necessary. After all, no eggs were laid, especially with a chicken known by the name of Babs. And well, Babs, Bunty, Mac, Fowler, they eventually get into a big fight. Especially after coming to realize the truth about Rocky. Because when Ginger goes around and claims a certain half of a poster, since after all, that poster was just half of a full-size poster. And she finds the other half and reveals the grim truth to the others. Rocky is a fraud. He actually doesn't know how to fly, but he was basically propulsing out of a cannon. And just as we heard from Mac earlier in the film, thrust was apparently the secret to achieving successful takeoff and flight, just as how we've seen from birds like geese. So of course, while Mac does get some insight out of the idea that a cannon could successfully fire them out, obviously tension grows to the point where there is a huge fight that goes on. Thankfully, Ginger is able to convince the others to stop before it gets so ugly. And after all, she finds out that there is another way to get out of there. After all, Fowler was, again, a former member of the RAF, a popular English Air Force. And the thing is, they just might have a way of getting out of there. Thanks to Fowler's own insight, they actually were able to create a flying craft known as the crate. And this crate in particular was made using all of the materials they could have possibly gotten a hold of. They got a hold of some tools from Mr. Tweety, they got a hold of some materials, and a lot of other things. They were able to successfully create their flying aircraft. This crate in particular would have the power and capacity to carry all the chickens, and using manual movement from a system of gears, pulleys, and plenty of other mechanized contraptions. It all seemed like a crude mashup, but it actually was a success, and through this, they could actually make their way out of there. With the same sort of flight capabilities as one would get from a goose or something, well, the night comes by. The machine is successfully fixed by Mr. Tweety as he tests it, and it turns out to be running again. Just like that. Business goes back as usual. As Mr. Tweety goes out again to find more chickens, he finds out that they actually stole his tools. And apparently, it's just like he had known the whole time. They were in fact organized, and this time they were actually ready for him. Because once he finds them, they attack him. They maul him. They tie him up and gag him so he can't call out for help. And as he just lays there, watching the chickens get into the crate and eventually prepping for takeoff, well, we do get a bit of a cut back to Rocky, where an advertisement about the Tweety Farms chicken pie stuff is apparently going on. And he does eventually realize he made the mistake of leaving the coop itself. So, what we get here is basically an eventual attempt by Mr. Tweety, whom barely is able to bring down the ramp that would have allowed the crate to successfully take off. And while he does fall unconscious again, Mrs. Tweety would actually follow not too far behind him. And she manages to catch Ginger attempting to bring the ramp back up. And armed with an axe, she is in fact able to pin her down, claiming that she's going to be a pie. But then, boom, Rocky comes in and knocks her out, and her hatchet falls right next to her face. So talk about a big takedown by a chicken riding a trike. Of course, Rocky and Ginger bring the ramp back up. The crate takes off. They both climb onto the nearby Christmas lights and successfully make it on board. A slap from Ginger reminds Rocky that he did screw up badly. And well, because he decided to return, Ginger thankfully turned the tide for him. Unfortunately, this little reunion's cut short. Mrs. Tweety once again tries to, in fact, get a hold of the chickens. Grabbing onto the Christmas lights, her weight basically does upset the balance and merely causes the crate to almost lose control. But because of Fowler and the combined efforts of all the chickens pedaling, they are able to keep aloft. But it was only temporary, because if they didn't find a way to let Miss Tweety out, they would have had to eventually come to a landing. Thankfully though, there's some quick thinking done, not only by Rocky, but also two rats that had actually been responsible for stealing tools and other items of value for the chickens to use in their act of escape. There was also a bunch of eggs that they had left over, mainly for the rats to have. But unfortunately, even after using up all the eggs, Mrs. Tweety still is not letting go, and Ginger ends up getting too close to her. So of course, even though she can't cut or bite through the wires to basically let go of the excess weight, there eventually comes a big swing from Mrs. Tweety's hatchet, and we're left there thinking, Ginger's head just got sliced off. So talk about it not only being graphic, but horrifying. In addition to having one chicken's head be sliced off, we have to see another in this movie, and this time it's the main protagonist. Yeah, talk about it being a gruesome way to supposedly end someone's life. I mean, I wouldn't have it any other way if I say so myself. However, it's revealed that Ginger's head wasn't sliced off, but it was actually the wire. And believe it or not, once she reveals it, she lets go of the half Mrs. Tweety's on. She basically flies right into the hole in the barn, landing on the top, basically through an open valve in the pie machine. This is basically where the gravy reservoir would fill up. And the vent is supposed to be unblocked the whole time to prevent excess pressure. However, the machine was cranked to max earlier in anticipation of all the chickens. And while Mrs. Tweety's body was stuck inside the reservoir, partially outside, The pressure inside the gravy chamber built up to a point where the whole thing explodes. It's an epic sight. You know, all that gravy is out there, and Mr. Tweedy just slams the door behind him on his way out of the barn, knowing that his wife is just stuck, and he can't do nothing about the inevitable. The explosion thankfully doesn't harm him, and when he opens the door again to find her just laying there alongside the dogs, he just simply repeats, the chickens were organized after all. And to follow it up, despite her efforts, she just cannot stop a door slamming on top of her, proving once and for all that her own husband has had enough. And just like that, this was in fact the supposed ending to a horrifying antagonist. And to be fair, with a duo the likes of, you know, these two actors alone, with Miranda Richardson and of course Tony, the Tweedies are basically putting an end there, while the chickens make their escape. They go far, far away, to a point where we get to see paradise. Younger chicklets are taught about the value of flying by Fowler, and as we get to see more of the likes of Rocky and Ginger, this movie ends on such a high note that who would have thought a sequel could have been made? Well, as far back as 2019, I have in fact heard about the idea of a sequel to Chicken Run being made, and even the infamous cutting of Julie Sawalha, because she apparently sounded too old. I mean, that was such huge news to me. I never would have expected people to think that Julie was so old that she shouldn't play her own character again after 20-something years. Well, you know what? Just because I'm mentioning it right now, we're going to count this as criteria necessary for films I'm willing to talk about again. So, if you tune in tomorrow, I will in fact talk about Chicken Run: Rise of the Nugget, the sequel to Chicken Run. So, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and if you're wondering about the score, 8.9 out of 10.1, almost a mere masterpiece. And also, stay on the Hollywood side for more content.
Whatever I want, I usually get, and I'm thinking I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.